"I've never seen you look so lost." "I wasn't lost that day," he admitted quietly. "I was certain. That's what frightens me now." Another long silence followed. Finally, he spoke again. "I spent years believing I could read people in seconds." His wife replied, "You were reading your own fears, not the person sitting in front of you." Those words settled heavily inside him. The next morning, he declined every interview request waiting in his inbox. Public relations advisors had already prepared carefully written statements, filled with legal language and polished apologies. He deleted them all. Instead, he opened a blank document. The cursor blinked. For several minutes, he could not type a single word. Then he finally wrote one sentence: "I was wrong." He stopped again. For the first time since boarding that aircraft, he wasn't writing to protect himself. He continued, "I believed someone did not belong because of how he looked. No amount of frustration, pressure, or misunderstanding excuses what I did. The cameras exposed my actions, but they also exposed something I refused to see inside myself." He read the paragraph aloud. It sounded painful. It also sounded true. His attorney called moments later. "Are you sure you want to release that?" "Yes, it admits responsibility. It should. There may be consequences." There already are. After ending the call, he looked outside his office window. People hurried along the sidewalk, carrying coffee, answering phones, living ordinary lives. None of them knew the weight he carried into every morning now. Weeks passed. The news cycle changed. New scandals replaced old ones. Television crews stopped. Calling social media moved on, yet every time he entered a restaurant, an airport, or a conference room, he remembered the man who had quietly straightened his stained jacket without demanding respect. That memory refused to disappear. Months later, he received an unexpected envelope. There was no return. Address inside rested a single airline napkin. Clean folded, carefully. No signature. Only one handwritten sentence. "Every person deserves to be seen before being judged." His hands trembled. He never discovered who mailed it. Perhaps it came from a passenger. Perhaps from a crew member. Perhaps from someone who had simply watched the footage. It no longer mattered. He folded the napkin again and placed it inside his desk drawer, not as a keepsake of humiliation, but as a permanent reminder. Awards had once decorated his office walls. Now, one ordinary paper napkin carried more value than every trophy he had ever earned, because success had built his career. But one painful lesson had finally begun rebuilding his character. The room remained silent long after his final sentence settled into every heart. Reporters lowered their cameras instead of rushing to ask another question. Executives exchanged thoughtful glances, recognizing that no prepared statement could equal the honesty they had just witnessed. Even the businessman remained motionless, unable to escape the truth that had unfolded without anger, humiliation, or revenge. The father's words had reached places that authority never could, leaving behind reflection instead of resistance. He stepped away from the podium without waiting for applause. His son walked beside him, still wearing the quiet composure that had carried him through the entire ordeal. A young journalist finally spoke. "Sir, after everything that happened, how did your son stay so calm?" The father smiled gently before looking at his son. "I taught him something my own father taught me," he replied. "Never let another person's prejudice decide who you become." His son nodded. "I wanted justice," he said softly. "Not another argument." Those simple words settled across the room once again. A flight attendant slowly stood from her seat near the back. "I owe you both an apology," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I believed confidence instead of checking the facts. I thought I was keeping order, but I helped create something unfair." The father answered without hesitation. "Thank you for saying it. Accountability is where change begins." Another employee wiped away tears. "I'll never make that mistake again." "You won't," the father said, "because now you'll see people before assumptions." Several parents sitting among the audience reached for their children's hands. No one instructed them to do it. The moment simply reminded them how easily ordinary lives can be changed by careless judgment. One teacher quietly whispered to another reporter, "I'm sharing this story with every one of my students." Nearby, a pastor nodded. "So am I with my congregation." The father looked around the room one last time. "If this only protects my son," he said, "then we've learned very little. If it protects the next stranger whose name nobody knows, then today truly matters." No one interrupted him. The silence felt different now. It no longer protected fear or prejudice. It protected understanding. As father and son walked toward the exit together, nobody noticed the expensive suit or the executive title anymore. They saw only two people leaving with quiet dignity after choosing grace over bitterness. Outside, the waiting crowd parted without being asked. Respect followed them naturally, proving that genuine leadership leaves behind more than policies or speeches. Kurt leaves ordinary people determined to treat the next stranger with fairness before making a single assumption. The conference room slowly emptied, but the conversations it had started refused to end. Reporters packed away their microphones. Employees returned to work and investigators closed their notebooks. Yet across the country, families continued replaying the story together. What had begun inside one first-class cabin no longer belonged to an airline. It now belonged to millions of ordinary people, deciding what kind of neighbors, parents, co-workers, and citizens they wanted to become. One evening, a young boy looked up from the television after watching the full story with his parents. "Dad," he asked quietly, "why didn't anyone help him before they found out who he was?" His father stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "I wish I had a better answer." His daughter spoke next. "Would you have said something?" The question settled heavily over the dinner table. "I hope I would have," he admitted. But hope isn't enough. We have to choose courage when the moment comes. Across another city, a middle school teacher stood before her students. "I'm not giving you this story because it's about an airline," she explained. "I'm giving it to you because every one of us will someday watch someone being treated unfairly." A student raised her hand. "What if I'm scared?" The teacher smiled gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you decide someone else's dignity matters more than your comfort." The classroom remained unusually quiet. Meanwhile, in churches, mosques, temples, and community centers, leaders reflected on the same lesson. "We cannot claim to love our neighbors," one pastor said, "if we only defend them." After learning their importance, an imam added during a community gathering, "Every human being deserves honor before anyone asks their name." Those words reached far beyond religious. Wall's airport slowly changed too. Passengers, waiting at boarding gates, noticed elderly travelers struggling with bags. Complete strangers offered help. Flight attendants paused a little longer before making assumptions. Travelers who witnessed tense conversations listened more carefully before choosing sides. None of those moments appeared on the evening news. None became viral, yet each one carried the quiet influence of that unforgettable flight. Months later, another passenger questioned a young black traveler about his seat assignment before boarding. Before the conversation could grow uncomfortable, an older woman nearby stepped forward. "He has his boarding pass," she said calmly. "Let's check the facts before we judge." "Anyone?" The employee smiled. "You're absolutely right." The misunderstanding ended in seconds. No cameras recorded it, no headlines followed. But the young traveler smiled with relief, unaware that another family's painful experience had quietly protected him. Back at headquarters, the father and his son boarded another flight together. No announcements recognized them. No special treatment waited at the gate. They walked aboard like everyone else. Greeted by simple smiles and genuine respect, the father glanced at his son. "Looks different now," his son nodded. "Not because people know who we are." "No," his father replied softly, "because more people are finally choosing to see who others are." As the aircraft lifted into the morning sky, another ordinary journey began. The headlines had disappeared, but the lesson remained alive wherever compassion reached a decision, before prejudice ever had the opportunity to speak. The months that followed brought changes few passengers noticed at first, yet employees felt them every day. The airline never claimed perfection, nor did it pretend one investigation had solved every problem. Instead, leaders focused on rebuilding trust through consistent actions rather than impressive announcements. The painful flight that had once threatened the company's future gradually became the standard against which every new decision was measured. Inside a training room, a senior instructor stood before a group of Newly hired flight attendants. We're not beginning with service manuals today, she said. Several recruits exchanged curious looks. We're beginning with a story. She played the complete cabin footage. Nobody spoke until it ended. What do you notice? She asked. One trainee answered carefully. The passenger stayed calm. Another added. Everyone believed the loudest voice first. A third employee lowered his eyes. The boarding pass could have been checked before anything else happened. The instructor nodded. Exactly. Procedures matter. But people matter first. Those words remained written across every training room afterward. Elsewhere, independent review teams quietly examined customer complaints without reporting directly to airline executives. Employees welcomed the change, knowing fairness became stronger when honest questions came from people with nothing to protect. At another airport, a gate agent faced a disagreement over assigned seats. Instead of reacting immediately, she smiled politely. Let's verify everything together. Within seconds, the misunderstanding disappeared. Her supervisor quietly approached. Afterward, nice work. I remembered the training. You remembered the passenger, she smiled. That's the point. Across hundreds of flights, similar moments unfolded every day. Flight attendants listened longer before responding. Managers encouraged questions instead of quick conclusions. Supervisors reminded employees that confidence should never replace evidence. Passengers noticed the difference little by little. One traveler later wrote in a customer survey, I've never felt more respected during a flight. Another commented, the staff treated every person exactly the same. No marketing campaign could have carried greater value. Years later, the story remained part of every employee orientation. New hires no longer viewed it as a corporate failure alone. They saw it as proof that institutions become stronger when they refuse to hide uncomfortable truths. One afternoon, the father and his son quietly boarded another flight without anyone recognizing them. They watched crew members greet every traveler with equal patience, verify every concern respectfully, and solve every problem without assumptions. The father smiled. This is the airline we hope to build. His son looked around the cabin before answering. It wasn't built by forgetting what happened, no, his father replied softly. It was built by remembering it every single day. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the journey ahead represented more than another successful departure. It reflected an organization that had learned lasting excellence begins not with flawless service, but with protecting every passenger's dignity before the wheels ever leave the ground. The aircraft that carried so much pain eventually completed its journey, but the lessons it delivered never reached a final destination. Long after investigators closed their reports and policies were rewritten, the recordings continued traveling farther than any flight route. Universities, leadership programs, aviation academies, and community organizations requested permission to study the footage, believing its greatest value rested not in exposing failure, but in preventing another one. Inside a training academy, an instructor dimmed the lights before pressing play. Watch carefully, she said. Don't look for the loudest mistake. Look for the quiet chances to prevent it. The room remained silent until the video ended. A trainee finally spoke. The biggest failure wasn't only the drink. No, the instructor replied. It was every moment before it. Another student added. Someone could have stopped this much earlier. Exactly. Justice often begins with the smallest decision. Outside the classroom, the conversation continued in neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. People no longer argued only about the businessman or the airline. They discussed hesitation, assumptions, and the responsibility every witness carries. Young supervisors entering leadership positions often remembered that recording before making difficult decisions. Verify. First, one manager reminded his team, listen before deciding. Another repeated. Those simple habits slowly became part of everyday leadership. The CEO continued receiving invitations to accept awards for his response, yet he politely declined most of them. This story isn't about me, he told organizers. It's about making sure nobody else needs a title before receiving respect. His answer spread almost as widely as the original incident. Meanwhile, people who replayed the footage noticed details they had missed before. A worried glance, a brief pause. A chance for someone to ask one more question before judgment took over. Each viewing revealed another opportunity where compassion could have changed everything. Years passed, yet the calm dignity shown inside that first-class cabin never faded from public memory. Anger would have made headlines for a week. Quiet character continued teaching for generations. The cameras had stopped recording long ago, but their purpose had only grown stronger. They reminded future employees, travelers, and leaders that fairness begins with ordinary choices made before pressure rises. Because people remembered instead of forgetting, one painful flight became something greater than history. It became a promise that respect would always come before assumptions, evidence before conclusions, and humanity before prejudice for everyone. The lessons carried by the recordings remained alive, and several months later, the same airport welcomed another ordinary morning of departures. Nothing about the terminal looked unusual. Travelers hurried toward security. Children laughed beside rolling suitcases, and boarding announcements echoed through the concourse. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, employees remembered the flight that had changed the airline forever. Respect was no longer treated as a courtesy, reserved for easy situations. It had become the beginning of every conversation. The father and his son arrived quietly, dressed like every other passenger. No executives greeted them. No photographers waited nearby. They checked their bags, accepted their boarding passes, and thanked the gate agent. "Have a wonderful flight," she said warmly. "You too," the father replied with an easy smile. Her kindness felt natural instead of rehearsed, and that mattered more than recognition ever could. Around them, every traveler received the same patient attention. Questions were answered without impatience. Boarding passes were verified before conclusions formed. Nobody rushed toward assumptions. The culture had changed because ordinary people had changed with it. As they waited near the gate, a little girl looked up from her coloring book. She studied the father's face before gently tugging her mother's sleeve. "I know him," she whispered. Her mother looked surprised. The girl walked over carefully. "Excuse me, sir." He smiled. "Yes? Were you the man on the airplane?" He nodded softly. "I was." She hesitated before asking, "Were you angry?" Nearby conversations faded as several passengers quietly listened. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No." She frowned slightly. "Not even after everything?" "I wanted people to learn," he said. "If they learned to treat strangers with kindness, then something good could grow from a painful day." The little girl smiled. "I'll remember. I hope all of us will." Boarding soon began without excitement or confusion. Families entered the aircraft together. Crew members welcomed everyone with equal respect, and passengers found their seats without uneasy glances. No cameras recorded the moment because none were needed anymore. The greatest victories rarely demanded attention. As the aircraft lifted above the clouds, the father looked through the window while his son settled comfortably beside him. Neither carried bitterness into the sky. Instead, they carried quiet hope that every future journey would begin with fairness, continue with compassion, and end with every passenger feeling they had always belonged together. The peaceful flight landed without incident, but its true destination had never been another airport. It had always been the hearts of the people who had witnessed, discussed, and learned from everything that unfolded. As passengers stepped into the terminal, they disappeared into ordinary lives, carrying luggage that could be weighed and memories that never could. The father watched families reunite, children race toward waiting grandparents, and strangers politely hold doors open for one another. Those simple acts reminded him that meaningful change rarely announces itself. It quietly becomes part of everyday life until kindness feels more natural than suspicion. Months turned into years, yet the story refused to fade completely. It appeared in classrooms where students debated fairness before forming opinions. It appeared inside leadership seminars where future executives studied responsibility instead of authority. It appeared in airports where newly trained employees paused before making difficult decisions, remembering that one unnecessary assumption had once shaken an entire institution. The businessman rebuilt his life away from public attention. He no longer sought recognition or defended old mistakes. Instead, he quietly supported organizations promoting fairness and respectful dialogue. He understood that forgiveness could never be demanded, only honored through consistent actions. Every day became another opportunity to become someone different from the man who had boarded that flight. Believing appearances revealed everything worth knowing. The airline also continued changing. New employees arrived without carrying the habits that had once allowed bias to survive. Veteran staff shared the story not with embarrassment, but with honesty. They wanted newcomers to understand that protecting a passenger's dignity mattered just as much as ensuring a safe landing. Procedures became stronger, but more importantly, compassion became stronger. For the father and his son, life gradually returned to ordinary routines. They traveled without cameras, attended meetings without whispered conversations, and enjoyed peaceful flights where no one recognized their faces. That anonymity felt like the greatest reward. Justice had never been about becoming famous. It had always been about making sure the next unknown traveler received the respect they deserved without needing influence, wealth, or a powerful title. Looking back, people realized the delayed departure had never been the most important part of the story. The spilled drink dried. The headlines disappeared. The investigations concluded. Yet one lesson continued traveling farther than any aircraft ever could. Prejudice often begins with quiet assumptions, but so does compassion. Every person chooses which one receives the next seat. As another aircraft disappeared into the morning sky, countless passengers settled into their journeys beside strangers whose stories they did not know. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Every boarding pass carries a human life far richer than first impressions can ever reveal. Justice does not always arrive through dramatic speeches or public victories. Sometimes it simply boards quietly, takes its seat beside ordinary people, and changes the direction of countless lives before anyone realizes the journey has truly begun. The quiet peace that followed the journey remained with the father long after the aircraft reached its destination. During every trip afterward, he found himself watching people instead of schedules. He noticed exhausted parents calming restless children, elderly couples helping one another through security, students traveling alone for the first time, and workers carrying worn briefcases after long business weeks. None of them wore signs explaining their stories. None announced their accomplishments before boarding. Yet every one of them deserved the same welcome, the same patience, and the same respect. His son noticed the thoughtful expression on his father's face. "What are you looking at?" he asked. The father smiled gently. "People. Do you wonder who they are?" "I wonder if they're being treated the way every person should be." His son looked around the terminal. "Most people don't know each other." "Exactly," the father replied. "That's when character matters most." The painful lesson from that first-class cabin had never been about discovering the airline's owner. It had been about exposing a dangerous habit many people never questioned. The businessman believed respect depended upon appearance. Some passengers believed confidence meant truth. Others waited for someone important to speak before deciding what was right. Only later did they realize fairness should never require a famous name. During leadership conferences, the father often repeated the same message. "If I deserved respect because I owned the airline," he told audiences, "then we learned nothing. I deserved respect because I was a passenger." The room always became quiet, he continued. "So does every person sitting beside you on your next flight." Those words spread through newspapers, classrooms, and training programs because they reached beyond aviation. Teachers shared them with students discussing kindness. Parents repeated them during family conversations. Managers used them when training new employees. The lesson belonged everywhere. People formed opinions before dues, learning the truth. The little girl who had once asked whether he was angry eventually wrote him a letter. "My teacher says everyone has a story," she wrote. "Now I try to imagine people's stories before I judge them." He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his desk. "It was worth everything," he whispered. Years later, passengers continued passing through airports without realizing how many quiet changes protected them. Most never heard about revised policies or improved training. They simply experienced patient employees, respectful conversations, and decisions guided by evidence instead of assumptions. That ordinary experience was exactly what justice had hoped to achieve. As another boarding announcement echoed across the terminal, strangers stood together in the same line, each carrying different dreams, different burdens and different destinations. Wealth, influence and reputation remained invisible inside every suitcase. Only humanity traveled openly. The father watched them board with quiet satisfaction, knowing the most valuable lesson from that unforgettable flight would never appear on a boarding pass or an executive title. It would live wherever people chose to offer kindness before curiosity, respect before judgment, and compassion before asking whether the stranger standing beside them was important enough to deserve it. Years passed, and the famous recording was no longer introduced by reporters as the video of a drink thrown across a first-class cabin. Most people barely mentioned the splash that had stained an expensive jacket. Instead, they remembered everything that happened before it and everything that changed afterward. The drink had been only a moment. The lesson had become a legacy. During leadership workshops, instructors paused the footage before the cup ever left the businessman's hand. What should have happened here? They asked. The answers were almost always the same. Someone should have verified the facts. Someone should have spoken up. Someone should have listened. Those simple responses reminded everyone that the greatest failure had never been the drink itself. It had been the unchecked assumptions that made the throw seem acceptable in the first place. At home, the father occasionally found the old jacket hanging quietly in his closet. The stain had disappeared years earlier after careful cleaning, yet seeing it always reminded him how quickly dignity can be challenged and how powerfully calm character can answer injustice. He never kept it as a symbol of humiliation. He kept it as proof that painful moments can become meaningful lessons when people choose growth instead of bitterness. Across the country, the story continued encouraging ordinary acts of courage. Travelers questioned unfair treatment with respect. Employees paused before making difficult decisions. Witnesses remembered that silence can either protect prejudice or protect truth. The jacket looked ordinary again, but the values revealed that day never returned to ordinary. They became part of countless daily choices made by people who had never stepped onto that flight. In the end, nobody celebrated the businessman's mistake or the passenger's suffering. They remembered something far more important. One careless action faded into history, but the compassion it inspired continued shaping hearts, conversations, and decisions, quietly ensuring that the next stranger would be welcomed with fairness before judgment ever had the opportunity to take a seat. The memory of that flight continued traveling farther than any airplane ever could, quietly changing how people looked at strangers they might never meet again. The father often said the greatest lesson was not about what happened inside one cabin. It was about what people failed to see before it happened. One afternoon, while waiting at another airport, he watched hundreds of passengers moving through the terminal. A young woman hurried toward her gate with tears in her eyes. An elderly man carefully folded a military cap before placing it inside his carry-on. A nurse in wrinkled scrubs leaned against the wall, exhausted after finishing a long shift. A teenage boy nervously clutched a folder marked "College Interview." Nearby, a mother quietly entertained her daughter while pretending not to notice the worry in her own face. His son stood beside him and asked, "Do you think they're all traveling for different reasons?" His father nodded. "Every one of them. And we'll probably never know." "That's true," he replied, "but we don't have to know their stories to treat them with respect." Those words stayed with his son as boarding began. Inside the aircraft, passengers politely helped one another lift heavy bags into overhead bins. Someone offered an aisle seat to an elderly traveler. A businessman gave up his place so a young family could sit together. None of those people asked about careers, bank accounts, or social status before showing kindness. They simply recognized another human being. Watching those small moments, the father smiled quietly. "This," he whispered, "is how travel should always feel." Airports had become more than transportation hubs in people's minds. They had become reminders that thousands of unseen stories cross paths every single day. One traveler might be flying home to meet a newborn child. Another might be saying goodbye to a dying parent. Someone else could be beginning a dream job, escaping danger, attending a graduation, or returning after years away. None of those journeys could be understood by looking at clothing, skin color, confidence, or the seat printed on a boarding pass. The famous incident had encouraged millions to replace quick conclusions with simple questions. patient listening and thoughtful observation. It reminded people that assumptions often fill the space where compassion should have lived first. As the aircraft lifted smoothly into the clouds, strangers settled into peaceful silence, each carrying hopes, fears, responsibilities, and memories invisible to everyone around them. No announcement revealed those hidden burdens. No ticket displayed their personal history. Yet every passenger deserved the same welcome, the same protection, and the same dignity. Perhaps that was the quiet truth people carried long after the headlines disappeared. Every face tells only a tiny part of a much greater story. The rest remains unseen until kindness chooses to ask instead of assuming, to listen instead of judging, and to honor another person's humanity before demanding proof that they are worthy of respect. As the aircraft disappeared beyond the clouds, its greatest destination was never another city. It was the conscience of the people who had witnessed the story. Many of those passengers later admitted that what stayed with them was not the argument or even the public attention. It was the memory of remaining silent when someone needed support. An elderly woman often remembered the few words she finally spoke. "He has done nothing wrong." She wished she had spoken sooner. The young mother who once lowered her eyes promised herself she would never again wait for someone else to defend another person's dignity. She taught her son that kindness is not measured by private beliefs, but by the moments when speaking feels difficult. The flight attendant carried the same lesson into every future journey. Whenever uncertainty appeared, she paused, verified the facts, and listened before reaching conclusions. Her quiet change influenced younger crew members, proving that courage can spread just as naturally as fear. Across schools, offices, neighborhoods, and airports, people began recognizing familiar moments they had once ignored. A disrespectful remark, an unfair accusation, someone being judged before having the chance to speak. More often than before, another voice gently interrupted. "Let's make sure we know the facts. Maybe we should ask first. That doesn't seem fair." None of those words were dramatic. None became headlines. Yet they prevented countless ordinary moments from becoming painful memories. The famous flight taught people that injustice rarely grows because everyone agrees with it. More often it survives because too many decent people hope someone else will act first. From then on, many chose differently. They discovered that courage does not always begin with a loud protest. Sometimes it begins with one calm sentence spoken at exactly the right moment. When compassion finds its voice, even quietly, silence stops protecting prejudice and starts protecting humanity instead. The choice to speak up gradually inspired another lesson that reached even deeper. People realized the greatest act of courage on that unforgettable flight had never been the revelation of ownership or the investigation that followed. It had been the remarkable discipline of one man who refused to let humiliation decide his character. Many expected him to answer insult with anger. They expected raised voices, threats, or demands for immediate punishment. Instead, he answered with patience, even after every reason to lose it had been placed before him. Later, during interviews, someone asked whether he regretted staying so calm. He smiled gently. "If I had become the loudest person in the cabin," he replied, "people might have remembered my anger instead of the lesson." Those words spread almost as widely as the original story. Young leaders quoted them during graduation speeches. Teachers repeated them in classrooms. Parents shared them with children facing unfair treatment at school. The message remained surprisingly simple. Strength is not measured by how loudly someone can respond. It is measured by what they choose to protect. When emotions demand the opposite, the businessman eventually accepted responsibility because calm truth left him nowhere to hide. The airline embraced reform because dignity had exposed weaknesses that shouting never could. Communities changed because compassion invited reflection instead of revenge. The passenger never celebrated another person's downfall. He welcomed accountability, accepted sincere apologies, and encouraged improvements that would protect strangers he would never meet. His goal had never been personal victory. It had always been lasting fairness. Years later, people remembered his composure even more clearly than the confrontation itself. They understood that patience had accomplished something anger rarely achieves. It opened hearts without closing ears. It had corrected injustice without creating another enemy. That became the story's quiet legacy. Courage does not always arrive with applause or dramatic speeches. More often, it walks into difficult moments with steady resolve. Gentle words, and enough character to choose wisdom when bitterness would seem far easier. The lesson about quiet courage continued spreading long after the aircraft landed, but its deepest meaning had not yet fully reached the people who had followed the story from the beginning. As the months passed, investigators completed their work, policies changed, and public attention gradually turned toward newer headlines. Yet those who had witnessed the incident understood that the real turning point had never appeared inside an official report or a courtroom statement. It had arrived much earlier, during the exact moment one man chose character over resentment. The businessman had relied upon confidence, social standing, and assumptions to control the situation. He believed appearance revealed everything worth knowing. The passenger had relied on none of those things. He simply remained honest, patient, and respectful when every reason existed to abandon those values. Looking back, many passengers admitted the outcome had been decided long before anyone learned his identity. Integrity had quietly defeated prejudice before the investigation ever confirmed a single fact. That realization spread through every conversation that followed. An elderly passenger later told her grandchildren, "I thought the lesson began when he said he owned the airline. I was wrong. It began when he refused to become the person they expected him to be." A former flight attendant shared a similar reflection during a training seminar. "The title changed the investigation," she said softly. "His character changed us." Those words stayed with everyone in the room. Students studying the case noticed the same pattern. The evidence mattered. The policies mattered. The accountability mattered. But none of those things would have carried the same weight if dignity had disappeared during the confrontation. The passenger's calm response became the foundation upon which every later reform stood. He proved that truth possesses remarkable strength when it refuses to compete with hatred. Gradually, the businessman reached the same painful conclusion. He understood that the greatest difference between them had never been wealth, education, or influence. It had been the choices each man made during the same difficult moment. One allowed prejudice to guide his actions. The other allowed character to guide his response. That contrast became impossible to escape, and it remained far more powerful than any public apology ever could. Communities remembered that lesson because it reached beyond race, airports, or corporate leadership. It spoke to everyday life. Every workplace disagreement, classroom misunderstanding, neighborhood conversation, and family conflict offered the same choice. People could respond from fear and assumption, or they could respond from patience and integrity. Years passed, but the story refused to fade. Airplanes continued lifting into morning skies. Travelers hurried through terminals carrying backpacks, briefcases, baby strollers, and quiet hopes for wherever they were going next. Most never knew anything about the strangers walking beside them. They did not know who had struggled through illness, who had worked overnight, who was flying to celebrate new life, or who was saying goodbye to someone they loved. Every boarding gate gathered people whose stories remained invisible behind ordinary faces. That truth became the final lesson remembered by countless families. Humanity always travels together, whether people recognize it or not. Every destination begins long before wheels leave the runway. It begins with the respect shown between strangers sharing the same journey. Justice does not require extraordinary moments every day. More often it grows through ordinary choices repeated again and again, listening before judging, asking before assuming, and extending kindness before demanding proof that someone deserves it. The famous flight eventually disappeared from front-page headlines, but its greatest message never needed publicity to survive. It lived on whenever a traveler offered another passenger a smile instead of suspicion, whenever an employee chose evidence over assumption, whenever a witness found the courage to speak, and whenever someone remembered that dignity belongs equally to every human being. Long after that aircraft completed its journey, the world continued taking its own. The destination remained uncertain, but one truth traveled faithfully with every flight. No person's worth should ever be measured by appearance, status, or first impressions. Character will always outlast prejudice. Compassion will always travel farther than fear. And humanity reaches every destination together when people choose to carry respect before anything else.